Final speaker of this evening is Sam Speary. Sam is a second-year undergraduate student reading history at Clare College. They won the right to speak through open audition. Sam, the floor is yours.
Crikey, I've got a bit of a hill to climb, haven't I? Look, a lot has been said tonight and there's been quite heated debate, but let's really bring it back to the content of the argument, which is this House believes trade unions are still an effective force for good. That's where we need to get to tonight. That's what we're discussing. We're not discussing whether or not we like the Conservative government. We're not discussing whether or not trade unions were great at one point, have changed back. We're discussing whether they were initially, which I strongly think they were, whether they're still effective and good now. That's the content. That's what we're focusing on. Unpick that from the conversation. Foremost, being a force for good mandates achieving something, actually achieving some kind of substance. Otherwise, you're just a force for nothing. So you have to actually find some kind of current achievement. Not in 2012 or back in 2001. Now, what are they achieving now? Is there any substance there? See if you found that tonight from the proposition. Not right now, not right now. Let me make some progress and then we'll move on to points of information. And in lieu of this, search what exactly they mean when they tell you trade unions are a force for good. When you struggle to recognise more substance than initial intention, and the initial intention is some substance in and of itself, begin to consider the possibility that simply being organisations with good intentions is insufficient to meet the thresholds the motion demands. What would good intentions with no substance point at? I think you're going to find this resonates with what you've heard tonight. Are talking about the greatest quality of life for the greatest number of people, but not setting out a roadmap on how it can feasibly be achieved. Talking about increasing working and living standards without any reference to opportunity, cost, demand, or the practicalities of doing so. Maybe they're discussing the relationship between the people, the government and legislation, without actually having a grasp on public polling data. And what about when these key objectives contradict each other? What then? For example, after 2 months of destabilising strike action nationally, I'm sure you'll all be very, very pleased to hear that the Conservative Party stopped its collapse in the polls. Moderate English vote, and that's a fact, by the way, regardless of what you think of the Conservative Party, that is the consequence of the strike action. The Conservative Party is no longer tumbling in the polls. Go on.
We've really reached an idea for the Conservative Party when you're claiming being 25 points behind is a massive triumph.
Well, okay, Sammy. But that doesn't take away from the substance, does it? One of the functions of pressure groups is to be, trade unions is to behave as pressure groups. That's a serious consequence that needs to be considered. Moderate English voters who overwhelmingly vote in favour of public expenditure measures, and they do, overwhelmingly, public expenditure is popular, therefore could electorally support the union's cause. But they're losing patience with the current discourse. You may not believe this. A YouGov poll's been mentioned. There's been a 4% jump in recent weeks in terms of union popularity. That's from a 30-year historic low, a 4% jump from a 30-year historic low. You have to ask yourself whether or not that is the effectiveness of the trade unions in their pressure group function that they're supposed to be having. I'd certainly argue it isn't. Need to make more progress, I've got limited time. So are the unions a force for good in this instance? They're campaigning for what is essentially an implausible change in exchequer policy, regardless of the morals and virtues behind it, and in doing so harming the electoral efforts of the Labour movement. I'm sure we broadly agree that a properly functioning opposition is crucial to the function of democracy, so why now, when a landslide victory for the Labour Party seems to be as certain as it could possibly ever be, have the trade unions decided to embark on this politically futile campaign that they can't feasibly have realised? It certainly isn't the case that this is effective in any regard. And if it's not achieving anything, how can it be achieving anything good?
Point of information.
Go ahead.
Could it be that it's because their members are demanding that they do something about their crisis, the cost of
I completely understand that, and I understand the tension. I'm not standing here telling you that the plights of working people who are seeing their wages stagnate since the advent of the Conservative government. I'm not sitting here, I'm taking one right now. I'm not sitting here and telling you that they've not got a point. What I'm actually telling you is what is being achieved, and I don't see very much substance. I really need to keep going. No, because I'm doing one question, bit of progress. So this is where still becomes critical. I just want to cover this briefly. I'm strongly in agreement with the proposition that there has historically been a positive, effective and good process and role for trade unions to play. That's quantifiable and discernible in my mind, but becoming outside of pressure groups recently means they've cut ties with Whitehall and lost insider access. This has allowed them. This has unfortunately hindered their ability to influence. This has hindered their ability to influence legislation. So why has it occurred? Well, the simple answer is that the current iteration of demands don't reflect the economic reality of Britain. And congruently, the political influence of the unions has waned under both Blair and the many iterations of Conservative government. Take, for example, legislation against secondary action and against closed shop policies. That has massively undermined the power of the unions in the last 30 years. The closure of closed shops and the banning of secondary action has massively impacted the ability of the unions to take secondary action. So you need to ask yourself, are they as effective as they were when you could still undertake secondary action?
So, I really, I don't need to brought it back forward. Anyways, point is I appreciate what you're saying, and I really appreciate pulling this in. I think tonight we've heard a lot about economics, and we've heard a lot about change in that aspect. But when you're talking about effective force for good, I think there's also things to be to note, and I would like to hear your point on health and safety, because I think unions also push for actually healthy and safety working environments.
I completely agree with you.
Economics. So I would like to hear about there.
So, but the problem, and this is the point I mean about becoming outside of pressure groups, right? Because there is a political press now against the government. They've lost that ability to negotiate with rationale because they're just ignored by the current government. Now, you might not think that's right. I don't think anyone here, by the sounds of things tonight, thinks it's great that the unions are being ignored by the government. But the substance and the point of the fact is that they are being ignored by government. So can you really call them effective? That's the question.
Information on that point.
Go on. You've been waiting.
Just two examples, because there are so many amazing people working in the trade union movement at this moment who are achieving great things. Two examples just in my community in Crewe. We saved, working with the FBU, we saved the local fire station. That saved 25 jobs. It's increased. That has been effective in saving jobs and protecting people within the community. Another example was trade unions locally were fighting to help nurses to have a fully paid lunch break. They're two small examples of why they're a force for good.
But the key point is they're working at a local level, and the reason, well, it's true, those are both local successes, and the reason they're being successful at local level, but you're not effective broadly, and you're not fulfilling the function you used to, and you're not as effective as you used to be. Now, you might not like that reality, but that's really the substance of the point. Take the revised pay packages for teachers then, okay? Just as a hypothetical, right? 5% increase across the industry and a 9% increase for new teachers. I'm certain that a great number of private sector workers would have torn the arm off of that offer last year. And by the way, that was what was advised to the government by an independent review body that was taking into account things like the economic damage that's caused not by wages, but by inflating wages and increasing government spending. Because by the way, increasing government spending, that's what increases inflation. It's not paying people the same wages you always used to pay them. I'm all right. I really need to get moving. I'm on page 2, and I reckon I'm probably 6 or 7 minutes through. So the problem is compounded by the fact that the majority of these industries had their wages massively inflated up until the Tory government came in 2010. So when you look at stagnation in the teaching industry, for example, and it is true, wages have stagnated for the last 13 years in the teaching industry. That's a fact. No, wage stagnation, not inflation. However, teachers in this country are still in the top 20% of international earners compared to their counterparts, and they work the second fewest number of hours, 300 fewer than the OECD average, every year. Now, don't take that from me. That was the Organisation for Economic Development. That came out this week at the same time these strikes, purely coincidentally. So you've got to ask yourself again, the trade unions, which they've thrown away a 5% pay increase, they've thrown away the 9% pay increase for new joiners. You've already got 23.6% annual pension contributions for teachers being offered, right? Why against that backdrop? How against that backdrop, when you know for a fact the government aren't going to offer more? Because they're not, because they know full well they're not going to go for an election, and they're not going to offer more, because that's the only way they have any hope to God whatsoever, even the modicum of it, of getting into power again of getting into power again in 18 months. So against that backdrop, can you really say that the trade unions are looking out for their workers? No more's going to be offered. You can do as much action as you like, but I'm telling you for a fact, we know what has these people behave. They've been behaving like this for 13 years. They're not going to increase that offer because A, they can't afford to, B, it would harm their electoral efforts, and actually, quite frankly, that's the only thing they care about at the minute. They don't care about working people. So given they don't care about working people, how are the unions going to fit into this?
Point information.
Johnny, hello, yeah, go.
Yeah, in 2020 alone, Unison negotiated a 10.5% pay increase for the lowest paid local government workers. GMB got £20,000 a year for all Scottish council workers. And Unite negotiated a £44,000 a year increase for Scottish water workers. There are massive successes, not just at the local level, at a regional level.
That was
far more if we deregulated the trade unions and allowed them to grow to the point that they were.
I agree with you, Johnny. I actually agree. But this isn't happening anymore. You can all clap. But this isn't the status quo. This isn't the state of play at the minute. This motion isn't saying they're effective last year, they're effective a few years ago. It's saying they're effective now. They're not going to get more than what they've been offered and rejected currently. Yeah, but look at the current strikes, Johnny, right? That's the essence of what we're talking about.
I think they're quite effective.
You might think so. You might think so. I'm all right. I've got 1 minute. I need to conclude. Look, and this is my last point, and I feel I probably haven't covered this well enough to actually make this conclusion. But young people are already picking up the tab for state spending. Health insurance and pensions for the elderly, a property market locked up to new entrants in which rent prices grow with property values, and over-leveraged national debt now causing inflation that, frankly, will soon drive up unemployment and make the graduate market even harder. To simply race inflation to the bottom of an economic spiral by borrowing to fund public sector incomes above the inflation rate is to condemn my generation and our generation to financial decay. So the role of the unions has to be to negotiate a moderate middle ground. After the 2008 crisis, we already knew we'd be the first generation since the Napoleonic Wars, which have somehow already been mentioned tonight, to be poorer than our parents. But against that backdrop, we already knew we'd be poorer than our parents. But if this is the legacy that the Labour movement chooses to leave for itself, which is essentially crushing the national economy by leveraging national debt to a point that is completely unsustainable. No, thank you, even though you didn't ask. If you thought Tory austerity was bad, and that was really just stagnated spending, and this is the final point I want to make, then you're going to hate IMF austerity. If you don't like stagnated wages, and that seems to be a lot of the crux of what the unions are requesting at the moment, you're going to hate it when the IMF steps in and starts rolling back on public sector jobs, when you actually don't have your job anymore. It's not going to be liked. And so you have to ask the question of if that's the right path, is borrow and tax and then spend. Is that really the progress? Is that really the direction we want to push for? And our pressure groups effective, our trade unions effective in their pressure group function by requesting this? I'm going to wrap up now, Nick. And it's for these reasons that I'd urge you strongly to vote in opposition tonight.